Welcome to Bridge Elections FAQ, a live discussion where our Capitol reporters answer your questions about the 2024 election. I'm Isabel Lohman. I'll be moderating this discussion. And today we have Simon Schuster and Lauren Gibbons, our Capitol reporters, here to answer your questions. If you have a question, you can throw it in the chat and we will get to it. And we are recording this event, and you'll be able to see a recap at our website, bridgemi.com. So as we talked about, there was huge news on Sunday. President Joe Biden said he was dropping out of the race for president and instead was endorsing his Vice President Kamala Harris to be the Democratic nominee. Simon, how did Michigan Democrats respond?
Yeah, so Michigan Democrats clearly were prepared to an extent for this news. I don't know if they necessarily expected him to immediately endorse a successor in Vice President Kamala Harris, but they were pretty prepared to rally around her. I think that in the hours following this news, which, to be clear, there had been, following his disastrous June 27th debate performance, there had been sort of a trickle of people saying, you know, there need to be a reevaluation of the campaign and our candidate, that had gone to a chorus of voices and then essentially a coordinated pressure campaign to get him to drop out. That dam finally broke on Sunday afternoon. And I think that people had long been considering next steps because there was sort of this air of inevitability coming. And so that anointed successor in Kamala Harris that Joe Biden has picked, that was someone that I think a lot of Democrats were prepared to back, both for logistical, political support, and also financial reasons, making the campaign finance work. And so we have now seen a number of notable endorsements from the majority of Democrats in the congressional delegation, save Rashida Tlaib, from many prominent state representatives, including House Speaker Joe Tate, and then now, most recently this morning, Governor Gretchen Whitmer.
Right. She's often mentioned as a possible presidential candidate or VP pick. Lauren, what is Governor Whitmer saying about this?
Yeah, well, she told reporters earlier, our colleague Jordan Hermany was at an event that she did this morning at the Capitol. She explicitly said, "I'm not leaving Michigan," when asked if she would take on the vice presidential role. If asked, she said, "I'm proud to be the governor of Michigan." She said she's not going anywhere. So that's what we know for now. She had been brought up as a prominent Democratic governor in a battleground state, and she had also gotten a lot of recent national press from her book and her subsequent book tour. So that is why she's sort of been on the minds of Democrats as this new opening came up. But as of now, she has confirmed that she's endorsing Harris and doesn't seem to be interested in VP.
Gotcha. We'll keep an eye out on that in case she changes her mind. Simon, earlier in the weekend, former President Donald Trump and his running mate, Ohio Senator JD Vance, they held a rally in Grand Rapids. What did they tell their supporters?
Yeah, so this was the first rally that came out of the Republican National Convention where Donald Trump chose his running mate, JD Vance. And this was, people were fired up at this rally. There was more, the capacity of Van Andel Arena's 12,000 seats. There's well above 12,000 supporters there. People were turned away still in line when the venue reached capacity. And so this was sort of a victory lap of sorts for Donald Trump, having narrowly survived an assassination attempt just a week ago. Having, you know, anointed a running mate at the Republican National Committee. And so this really felt almost more like a victory rally of sorts than a campaign rally. JD Vance came out, and I think that he was a bit taken aback by the sheer enthusiasm that he was feeling from the crowd. And he basically went and sort of wanted to normalize and tone down the rhetoric of that Democrats have assigned to some of the policies that Donald Trump is interested in implementing. It's sort of saying, you know, they're calling me radical, they're calling Donald Trump's platform radical, but there's nothing so radical about keeping jobs in the United States, you know, onshoring manufacturing, being more protectionist in trade policies, and pushing cartels and gangs, as he called them, out of the country by cracking down on immigration policy and sealing the southern border. But I think at the same time, this was also a bit of a poll test, given the uncertainty on the top of the Democratic ticket. At one point, Donald Trump asked the crowd, "I'm going to take a poll. How many people would like me to run against Kamala Harris?" And there was sort of a smattering of boos. But then when they said, how many people would like me to run against Joe Biden, there was a thunderous amount of boos. And so obviously, this is not necessarily a change that the Trump campaign had wanted to see happen. And it's going to be interesting to see how they pivot on their talking points moving forward.
You mentioned immigration. One of our readers asked about former President Trump's vow to deport undocumented immigrants. Mary asks, if he were elected again, how would that affect Michigan?
Yeah, and this is an interesting question too, because this was one of the sticking points of his first term, sort of where the rubber meets the road on this, on these policies. When you look at his campaign signs now, mass deportations now is some text that's emblazoned on signs at his rallies as things. It's a policy that they want to have happen. But of course, we're also a country where due process happens, and there has to be immigration courts where a process of removal has to happen, and there has to be the logistical realities of actually identifying or removing undocumented immigrants should he be elected. It's important to note that Customs and Border Protection can operate within 100 miles of an international border in the United States. And so that includes the entirety of Michigan because of our close international border with Canada. Immigration officials can work anywhere in the state, identifying and apprehending individuals who may not be in the country with authorization. And so I think that there's a lot of questions that remain to be answered as to how such a program would be implemented, how that would happen. But there certainly is the federal authority to do so within the state of Michigan anyway. Right now, there's about 91,000 people in the state without authorization. That's a little more than 1% of the state's population. But the question of whether this is going to happen, whether they could even find the funding to make it happen and make it a federal priority, is something that I think really remains to be seen should Donald Trump win the election in November.
Gotcha. We've talked a lot about JD Vance, who is Trump's pick to be his VP, but it was just a week ago that he was announced officially as the VP candidate. Our reader Jeff asked how the Republican National Convention went last week in Milwaukee.
Yeah, this was, I think, one of the most energetic, one of the most energized Republican National Conventions we have seen in a long time. I think that we saw the full realization of a Republican Party remade in Donald Trump's image. The agenda is suited towards his own beliefs and policies. And you didn't necessarily see the emergence of the rising stars that you often can see debut at a national convention, like, say, Barack Obama in 2004, the Democratic National Convention. There wasn't sort of that presence because there was already such an established leading figure. He didn't emerge from a primary process. He was sort of the foregone winner of these primaries. And then the only question remained was who he was going to select as his running mate. And especially coming off the assassination attempt, at first there was an air of somberness. Trump was subdued. And there was changed speeches, more talk. It changed in rhetoric to an extent, moving towards unity, talking about the nation coming together, toning down political rhetoric. And it lasted for some time, but only about as far as Donald Trump's speech, where after some initial talk on these topic points, he moved sort of back to more his traditional rhetoric, talking about red meat, the red meat issues that really fire up the Trump's base and, castigating President Joe Biden. And that's exactly what we saw in Grand Rapids, similarly in that rally, that if there was going to be some sort of big pivot, this was a change in Trump's character, his approach to campaigning. I think that people who were hoping to see that would be sorely disappointed. But the level of enthusiasm, I think, really gives cause for a lot of hope and celebration for Republicans, just because of the sheer energy levels that we saw at these events.
We've also seen photos of, some of his supporters wearing ear bandages, sort of in solidarity of the bandage that he had after the attempted assassination. Lauren, we had a reader who asked if Trump has renounced political violence.
Yeah, I think to Simon's point, he is sort of continuing business as usual. You did see a little bit of a pivot as he just suggested during the convention. It was very recent, very new. Another trend that has been interesting to watch is a lot of Republicans, including Trump, have suggested that Democrats should stop saying that Republicans are a threat to democracy. They're kind of arguing that rhetoric is also harmful. which is an interesting pivot because that is a big focus of the Democratic pushback to a second Trump term. They're very concerned about the fact that he did not accept 2020 election results. And so in more so than I've ever seen in recent weeks since the assassination attempt, you're seeing Republicans telling Democrats to stop saying that they're a threat to democracy based on that. So I thought that was just kind of interesting and wanted to point that out too.
Yeah, it was one of the core tenets of what the Democrats are saying. They've said that Trump is a threat to democracy. They've also focused on abortion rights. On the Republican side, there's more been talk about inflation and immigration. Roe versus Wade was overturned in 2022, just months before the midterms. How is abortion being talked about in this election cycle?
Yeah, you already saw VP Harris come to Michigan to talk about abortion. It's a huge issue, and it's one that Democrats are really banking on Democratic or even potentially independent or Republican leaning women voters could decide to vote on, especially with Project 2025 and a lot of other concerns about the future of access to birth control, or even protecting abortion rights in states like Michigan, where it's been codified at the state level. There's a lot of concern among Democrats that Republican victories in 2024 could backslide even further from the downfall of Roe versus Wade. So it's something that Democrats are really hammering home in their messaging to voters. They're hoping that it could be a turnout driver. Whether it is, I guess, remains to be seen. It's not on the ballot in Michigan as it was in 2022. So it kind of depends on what voters are thinking, but Democrats really hope that their voter base remembers the possibilities here.
For sure. And our colleague Jordan has written about the Republicans softening their stance, at least nationally, on abortion. So you can read that at our website, bridgemi.com. If you have a reader question, if you have a question about the election, we want to answer them, you can throw them in the chat right now. Another question that we got was about the potential for a debate. Will former President Trump agree to debate Vice President Kamala Harris?
That's a good question. I think that Trump will likely agree to this debate because agreeing to the debates is sort of a signal of strength. And that's something that I think is really important to Trump's personal image, is that he's willing to debate anywhere as many times as people want, and that he certainly has no shortage of words to provide on any particular issue. Now, whether that's going to happen in short order or in September, as originally scheduled against President Joe Biden before he left the race, I think that remains to be seen, but I would venture, and this is just a guess on my part, that that's probably going to go forward as is.
And of course, just a few weeks ago, the debate performance between Trump and Biden is sort of what started this whole cascade of people saying Biden needed to step aside. Glenn asks, what do we really know about why President Biden performed so poorly at the debate?
That's a good question. And the White House has offered some explanations. One of the things that they had pointed to was a grueling international travel schedule that he had had in the weeks preceding the debate. He had gone from Italy to for a G7 summit, if I'm recalling off the top of my head here, to Los Angeles for a fundraiser, and then back to Europe again for another diplomatic event, and then back to Washington, D.C. over a short period of time. So that's traversing like 9 time zones. And again, Biden is 81 years old. Now, all that said, I think what a lot of critics point out about this particular explanation is that then he went to travel to Camp David to prepare for the debate and had quite a few days, I think almost 2 weeks, to prepare for the debate before coming on board. And so one of his own explanations was that he had not gotten enough sleep and that he was exhausted on the stage. And he said that he was practically his own explanation was that he was practically falling asleep on stage because of how tired he had been. But that's not something that's wholly satisfying to a lot of people. One of the big differences is that Biden has prepared, he appeared in public really well when there's prepared remarks, a teleprompter in front of him that sort of shows, that gives him a script to read off. He's done pretty well off of that. But when there's more, I guess, more of an impromptu, more improvisational situation for the president, that's when he generally tends to fare worse. I mean, we saw this. He answered a lot of technical, really in-depth questions in a press conference with France, and a really high-stakes press conference for the NATO summit, where he was able to answer a number of questions with nuance and quite a bit of detail, but he still flip-flopped. He said Vice President Trump when he meant Vice President Harris at one point, and he said President Putin instead of President Zelensky of Ukraine. And so these are sort of innocent slip-ups that don't substantively impact his answers, but it shows sort of some of the difficulties that he's having. That obviously led immediately or ultimately to his withdrawal from the race.
And it's also worth just pointing out just the fact that the debate really set the stage for Sunday's decision. It was the debate that kicked off all of this public distancing from Biden's campaign, the calls that started slow but then grew to a fever pitch of whether he should step down. This is a historic decision that really reshapes 2024 in ways that we can't even begin to comprehend yet. We're starting to, but it is a really fascinating thing to me that this debate was what started that down the path. There were obviously concerns before about his age and his competency and his ability to really, hit back at Trump in an aggressive way during this 2024 cycle. But it was the debate that really changed everything and emboldened Democrats to come forward and say that publicly.
Yeah, absolutely, Lauren. That's such an important point. And one other thing that I would note in that regard is that for a long time, right-wing media sources had been talking about Biden's cognitive decline, which has been broadly dismissed by legacy media as something that was sort of conspiratorially leaning. But again, this is a president who had given the fewest in-person solo press conferences of any president in the modern era, I think since Richard Nixon, I believe. And so as a result, media didn't have the access to him unscripted that a lot of other folks did. And I think one of the things that we're going to see a lot sort of reevaluation or reflection from a lot of legacy media sources in the months to come is whether this is an issue that had not given its due attention in the months leading up to this, and that sort of the White House had gotten a pass on these sort of issues that allowed this to move to this stage where we've gone through all of the primaries, we're weeks from the convention, and now only are we grappling with the withdrawal of the presidential candidate who won 99% of pledged delegates.
And to put this in context, the debate was just a little bit shy of a month ago. The DNC is just about a month away, so we can expect a lot of news in these next few weeks. Lauren and Simon, I want to end on this. What can readers expect from Bridge, Michigan in the next month as we cover this continual election cycle?
I can start. We are, being nimble and trying to react to this news as the whole nation is right now. We spent a lot of time doing that Sunday and then the weeks preceding. We will be continuing to provide aggressive, in-depth coverage of all of the elections, not just the presidential, but up and down the ballot, and recognize that Michigan is a huge factor in whoever ultimately takes the presidency, potentially even the Senate, depending on how close the race between the general election race is, where the front runners currently are Mike Rogers and Alyssa Slotkin. So I think regardless of what happens in the coming weeks and months, we will be following it closely. We'll be, aggressively pursuing new leads and analyzing how this happens and what it means for Michigan voters.
No, I think all of those are really important things that I'm also going to be looking at. And one of the things that's standing out in my mind, particularly in regards to the presidential race, is that we had a race where the narratives around each of the leading candidates were essentially set. And now those things have fundamentally changed with the withdrawal of Biden and now Vice President Kamala Harris seeking to succeed him as the Democratic nominee. We have key constituencies such as softening support among the Black communities in Michigan, whether Harris can sort of revitalize some of the enthusiasm that had been waning among some of those voters. And when you look at Arab American voters who had been, and young voters who had been become apathetic or even resistant to voting for Biden because of his stance in the conflict between Israel and the Gaza Strip, whether Kamala Harris is going to still be married to sort of that narrative and that albatross of an issue moving forward is going to be really something I'm going to be watching closely as well.
For sure. So lots to keep up on. That's why we're here. There's a few different places you can find our reporting. Of course, our website, bridgemi.com. We have a nonpartisan voter guide on there. We have a regularly updated elections tracker. We have stories every single day about this upcoming election. And then if you want even more political news, you can sign up for our Politics Watch newsletter. It's free. It's at bridgemi.com/sign up. Thank you, Lauren and Simon, for being here. Thank you, everyone who chose to come today. We'll be back next week. We want to continue to answer your questions. So if you have a question for us, you can go to bridgemi.com and ask your question there. And like I said, we're regularly updating our website. We're doing this show to help you, and we want to hear from you. Thank you so much, and we'll be back next week.